on the phone. It has been too long. A frequent guest back on the Seder on Sundays and some of the Sam Seder shows back in the day. Professor Eddie Glaude. He is a religion and African American studies professor from Princeton University. Welcome to the program, sir.
It's always a pleasure. It's been too long.
I know it certainly has, and frankly, I've been meaning to have you on the program. And this interview reminded me, frankly, and so I'm glad we have an opportunity to talk about it. And I want to. We don't have too much time, so I don't want to go over the entirety of this. I've read some of the comments by Professor West, and to a large extent, I think, at least personally, and I don't want to speak for my audience, but I think there's certainly a sense that President Obama has been a political disappointment for progressives, specifically in the financial realm. And I want to go over a couple of things that he talked, because this is a very fascinating topic to me, because one of the things about Obama that has completely befuddled me from the beginning, and while I thought that Professor West makes reference to, he had faith in some sense that President Obama was aggressively populist and progressive, despite the fact that he had a rather centrist brief Senate career. And he mentions Lieberman, which of course was certainly it had stuck in my craw at the time too. But he goes on to say that that President Obama feels most comfortable with upper-class, middle white, and Jewish men who consider themselves very smart, very savvy, very effective in getting what they want. He's referring to guys like Larry Summers, and I presume guys like Robert Rubin, and people like Geithner, and which it's a critique that I have heard from both a political perspective, and when you get into the sort of the psychology behind it from an economic perspective, in that Obama came from fairly modest, humble beginnings, not unlike Bill Clinton, and sees these guys, these masters of the universe, as really deserving their positions and buying into the meritocracy. Professor West takes it from his perspective within the context of President Obama being a child of a mixed race couple, and I'm curious. Give me your sense of what your sense of what Professor West had to say.
Well, first, thank you for the opportunity to talk with you and your audience. It just seems to me that we have to divide the piece into at least two parts. One is the kind of personal dimension, where there is a sense in which Professor West gives voice to his own sense, his own feeling of being used and manipulated, in the sense that he stumped for President Obama, found himself out there working on his behalf. Unlike some of the responses out in the world, whether it's the Nation piece by Professor Harris Perry or others on Twitter or on the internet, Professor West, his relationship with President Obama did not fall apart after the State of the Black Union with the rift between Obama and Tavis Smiley. In fact, in Ohio, on the night of the election, when he won office, Professor West was stumping for him in Ohio, and speaking for him in Ohio, organizing for him in Ohio. So part of what you see in the first part is this kind of personal, very pained account of his own sense of betrayal, personal betrayal, that gets kind of it gets represented by this, what I take to be bad racial reasoning. And Cornel and I have talked about this face to face, that there's some the account of Obama being culturally white, its truth value, whether it's true or not, nothing follows from that in terms of the policy. What you see is Professor West really venting his sense of being used and manipulated. Then the second part of the piece,
Right,
Brother
and let me
Sam.
just, and I should say about that my sense is that, listen, we're talking about people who are very public people who obviously have healthy egos, and that is almost the most mundane part of the entire piece to me.
Absolutely, but
Because, I mean, this happens all the time, and sometimes we hear about it, and sometimes we don't. Everybody, the one thing that has amazed me since I've started doing this 9 years ago is hearing just how personal things work on this level. And, a guy goes out 65 times, uses his public persona. I don't fault him for feeling that, and I don't know that it really has much of a bearing on his political critique, frankly.
Right, and so which takes us to the second part. And the second part has something to do with the fact that many progressives, whatever we mean by that word, right, and I'm using Professor Melissa Harris Perry's language here, green screened Obama. And what I mean by that is that, you can put a green screen behind an actor or an actress and they could be in any scene.
Mm-hmm.
So in some ways, we green screened him. We made Obama seem like he was the anti-war candidate. We made Obama seem like he was a kind of, progressive figure who would challenge Wall Street, who would speak on behalf of the poor and the disenfranchised, right? And all along, President Obama, or then candidate Obama, was presenting a rather centrist platform. And so what you see in West is deep disappointment rooted in what I take to be a very serious critique that we need to kind of wrestle with, and that is that the current policies coming out of the White House and out of the Congress, right, are policies that are not addressing the most vulnerable, black poor people, not addressing poor people generally. That we see policies that A, continue the war machine, B, that benefit those on Wall Street, record profits, mm-hmm. And that there's capitulation and compromise in the name of some odd notion of breaking through the dysfunction of Washington, D.C., but that this notion seems to be, at least on my view, Brother Sam, seems to take the place on the backs of working poor people. And so what you see is this righteous indignation that Professor West expresses in the second part of the piece around the failures of President Obama's policies. And so you can talk to TARP, you can talk about TARP, you can talk about passage of health care, you can talk about the Lilly Belly legislation, you could talk about Don't Ask, Don't Tell. But every time people kind of run the gamut of what he's done, you kind of ask yourself the question, Sam, but what about poor people? Right. What about the most vulnerable? What about the fact that there's 28% unemployment, for the most part, in black communities across this country? Why can't we talk about this? And what you get is this really odd response that to do so is to engage in some kind of black identity politics, to expect him as the black president to speak to black people. And then you say, oh, wow, this seems to be shutting down critical conversations about how to address the social misery of black communities, because to address it specifically somehow means you're engaging in identity politics, when in fact what you're trying to do is address misery.
And it's interesting to me because his political critique is I don't see much daylight between that critique of Obama's policies than something Robert Reich might write, frankly.
Exactly.
And so, the idea that President Obama's Treasury Department rolls out HAMP, which is the home. Look, he made a decision at one point where they were either going to bail out the banks or they were going to go directly to the root of the problem, bail out the homeowners, which would have had a positive impact on the banks, but wouldn't have fed them directly. And I don't think there's any progressive out there who can deny the idea that he surrounded himself with Reubenites, neoliberal economists, who have prescribed a fix for the economy that considers the plight of the banks and the financial industries primarily. And
Absolutely, Brother Sam. And what's interesting, let's just talk about this in comparison to the Republican Party, right? You can have Tea Partiers, right? People who are concerned about big government, folks who are organized, many of around their own nativistic claims, their own concerns about losing ground, and they organize and they bring pressure to bear on the party establishment. They organize and they run people against candidates, and they're doing it within the context of the Republican Party. But when it comes to progressive voices within the Democratic Party, we're always told to toe the line, that we can't in some ways bring critique to bear, that we can't bring pressure to bear on what the DNC is doing, on what the White House is doing, on what the leadership, the Democratic leadership in the Congress, are what they're doing. It seems to me that progressive voices, whether white, black, brown, or yellow, we need to be speaking and yelling as loudly as we can on behalf of the most vulnerable in relation not only to this economic policy that has left banks to be, these big banks that can't too big to fail, they're still in place, that really feed the pockets of Wall Street oligarchs, as Cornel would say, and leave, shall we say, to wallow in misery those folk who can't seem to find their job, can't seem to find employment, those folk who are losing their homes, those middle-class folk who see that the future of their children, right, isn't as bright as their own present, right? And so we need to be speaking loudly and bringing pressure to bear. And the only thing that these folk do, it sounds like DLC stuff to me, right, is to say you need to support us because this is the outcome. No one is saying that to the Tea Party folks.
Yeah, and it's
right?
interesting.
And I'm not trying to. They're organized.
I hate to.
They're organizing and bringing pressure to bear.
I hate to, bring up Robert Reich again, but literally the last line of his last piece on his blog was, which leads to a more basic question: are we ready and willing to mount primary challenges to incumbent Democrats who cave? He's talking specifically about the so-called debt negotiations. We all know the Republicans are going to raise the debt limit ceiling, but yet we're seeing the Democrats and President Obama negotiating, involved in this kabuki theater. And so, I think that part of it, to me, again, is not controversial. The interesting thing, and I want to get into this, and this is a sort of a more esoteric conversation, because I had a conversation with a fairly established Politico type who we were talking about this idea that Obama has surrounded himself with these Reubenites type of people. And he was looking at it very much from this economic standpoint. And he said, look, I grew up with these people. I know these people. They cheat at tennis, and they were all C students. I don't believe that they necessarily belong where they are. I'm aware of the benefits that they had to get there. And this guy was saying that he feels, now we're getting into sort of psychoanalysis on some level, but it's a legitimate question that people have. Maybe it's more of a historical one, but he says, I think because Obama came from modest beginnings, that when in rising through these systems, becoming, you don't get elected the first black head of the Harvard Law Review without understanding the dynamics that are going on, without having a certain respect for the institution, and perhaps a certain blindness or a willingness to ignore certain elements of that institution, because it's hard to succeed in an institution while you're critiquing it simultaneously. And, this is the part that sort of interests me, just from a sort of almost an academic perspective, is this analysis? And
I mean,
go ahead.
I try. I understand the path that you're going down, Sam. I try to avoid it in the sense that I can't get into the mind of President Obama. I don't understand. I can't say with any degree of certainty what his intentions are, what motivates him to do X, Y, and Z. As a pragmatist, I can only look at the fruits of his policy.
Right.
We can only chart. Right. We can begin to get some indication of his philosophy of governance by looking at what he's doing. And what we do know is that poor people, middle class people, and we know that these terms are and how they're measured and defined in the public conversation, that they're fluid. But the people who are singled out by these words, people who are poor, people who are struggling in the middle class, that the current policies coming out of D.C., coming out of the Beltway, are not helping them. people can say, well, he saved the country from the economic brink, right? He pulled us from the economic brink. Okay, we can grant that. We can say that health care reform, right, opens up was a fundamental historic transformation of the healthcare system. We can say he made a gesture in this regard. We can say ending Don't Ask, Don't Tell means something, right? We can talk about what he's trying to do with regards to student loans. But when we're talking about jobs, when we're talking about what the public option meant for poor people and how he compromised on that, when we talk about financial regulatory reform and how he's backed down and allowed too big to fail to continue, all of this robbing Main Street that is divided by tracts, that's divided by poor neighborhoods and rich neighborhoods. When we talk about the most vulnerable in America and we look at the policies, not only coming from the Congress, but the policies that are coming from the White House, it is the basis of making a substantive and significant and perhaps harsh judgment of Obama's philosophy of governance. And I think progressive voices, Brother Sam, and this is where I thoroughly agree with Robert Reich, progressive voices, we cannot cower under the assumption that we have no other choice. And this is not the case.
And I would add that the other aspect of that equation that you're outlining is that there was a unique and I believe extremely rare, we may never see one, at least in my lifetime and your lifetime again, where there was a mandate, I believe, for a much greater change. There was a unique opportunity coming off of 8 years of Republican rule, where we had seen the massive amounts of corruption of our entire system, of increased corporate control, at a time where there was a crossroads in a moment, and I believe that moment's passed, sadly, where there could have been some fundamental change. I mean, forgive me for using that word, but I think the idea of change, people, I agree, it was a green screen. We projected a lot of things onto that, but it must have meant something, and we don't see it. I mean, go ahead.
No, absolutely. I don't know the energy of young people that was so much on display during the 2008 election. The record turnout of African Americans, the energy around the election itself, all kind of signaled that perhaps we were turning a corner as a nation. That the possibility of fundamental change, in other words, kind of breaking the back of the Reagan Revolution that has defined not only the Republican Party, but has defined the Democratic Party's response to the future of the nation. We thought that the back was perhaps broken, or we had broken through. But what we see is, in interesting sorts of ways, not just simply remnants, Brother Sam, of the status quo, but we've just seen shall we say, things just as they are, as they were. I mean, it looks like it's all the same, with just different characters in place. So DLC triangulation is still taking place. People are bolting to the center, and now the center is actually right. And again, I keep hitting on this because this is what was so important, and I regret that folks are talking about the more the personal part of Cornel's piece with Chris Hedges. But what's really important is that we don't hear the voices of folk really crying out on behalf of poor people, on behalf of those who are most vulnerable in this moment. Instead, what we have are people closing ranks around Obama and attacking and engaging in a kind of mob mentality to I think, dismiss someone like Cornel West, who's been a stalwart figure on the left, who's been an extraordinarily important voice for progressive politics in this country for well over 30 years.
Do you think it's illegitimate for members of the black community to have an expectation that President Obama would be more sensitive to the plight of African Americans in this country than than a white president. I mean, do you think that's an illegitimate expectation?
No, I don't think it's an illegitimate expectation. I mean, Stanley Fish a while back wrote a couple of pieces on identity politics in the New York Times. And what was interesting about his piece, he says there's a kind of base level of identity politics that makes perfect sense to him, and that is that there's a presumption on the part of certain people that people who have their group experience, who look like them, who are ethnically or racially coded in a certain sort of way, right, we can assume that they would at least be sensitive to the issues that confront that community. Beyond that, one shouldn't expect that what follows from that are the same values, the same policies, the same politics. Because you're black doesn't mean you hold the same positions,
right.
But there's a sense in which one can presume that no matter where you come from that group, if there's another person who identifies with that group, that there's a presumption of, well, there should be some sensitivity, some knowledge, right?
Right. I mean, as a society, I don't think there was anybody hesitated saying that John McCain had a better understanding of military issues because he was from the military. I mean,
right, or Joe Lieberman,
right.
could do could be thought of in similar ways in relation to Jewish communities, right?
Absolutely.
This is why it's so important this is why it was such an important thing, or Geraldine Ferrara, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is why these were historic nominations in some ways, right? But what's interesting, this is part of the neoliberal containment of race in the United States at this point, right? And that is that we can't talk about race in the public domain without fearing the kind of counterclaim, Brother Sam, that we're engaging in reverse racism.
Right.
And so there's, on the one hand, what's going on. There's this two-sided move that's taking place. On the one hand, there's a kind of sense, well, look, he's our first black president. We don't need to be complicitous in all of this racist critique coming at him. We need to surround him and protect him. We know he can't do much. And in that particular view, which is rooted and grounded in a certain kind of problematic identity politics, silences criticism. Then there's the other side, when people say, well, what are we to do about black suffering in the country? How are we to speak specifically to what's going on in urban cities, what's happening to black farmers, what's happening to black kids in the juvenile system, what's happening to black women and men in the prison industrial complex, what's happening to their children once they are incarcerated, what's going on? When we begin to talk about those specific sorts of issues, people then say, well, you can't hail the president in that way because he's the president of all Americans, right? So what happens? The typical form of interest group politics, when Hispanic organizations say to President Obama, you need to do something about immigration, and within the week we have a speech on immigration. When LGBT communities approach Obama and say we need to address that, or don't ask, don't tell, and he addresses it, boom, this is interest group politics. When unions say we need to speak in this way and that way with regards to workers, and he responds, boom. But when African American communities held the president in light of their he's the president of all Americans. Well, no one was saying that in relation to Hispanic organizations. No one was saying that in relation to LGBT groups. No one was saying that in relation to working unions. So what you get is this really interesting containment of race politics in the United States, which leaves communities, poor black people in particular, Brother Sam, poor black communities that are extraordinarily vulnerable in this moment, right, subject to all sorts of silences and lack of attention, if that makes sense. I hope that makes sense.
Well, two things occur to me. One is in the run up to the 2008 election, my partner at the time at Air America, Mark Maron, had a great joke that said that finally black Americans will have the opportunity to be screwed by one of their own. But at the same time, I will also say that while I think you're right in terms of the responsiveness from those different groups, I think that as a group, and perhaps the dynamic you're talking about has made it more difficult to sort of garner this type of energy. But those groups, the LGBT community, the Hispanic community, these are all groups that have been very, very active and have put a lot of pressure on it. I mean, the LGBT community, you had people chaining themselves to the White House, the White House gates. Right. I mean, and it's interesting. I mean, I think, we may not know really the verdict of the black community until we see what happens in 2012 when we look at things like turnout, or because
Exactly.
there clearly does not seem to be, from my perspective, any type of concerted effort within the leadership of the black community to really pressure Obama about these issues that you're talking about in the way that I've seen other communities do that. And maybe they are in some ways, prevented from doing this because of that dynamic you're referring to.
Well, this is really important because remember, the other side of the coin was not just simply the president can't address specifically the issues of black people. The other side of the coin is, let's not critique him, because then we become complicitous with racist critiques of him. So there's a way in which, but also I think it's really important, we need to stop being so Obama obsessed, right? And that is part of what we need to do, is to understand what it means to organize, what it means to engage in grassroots organization in our communities, both local, state, and nationally. What does it mean to hold not only President Obama accountable, but the so-called civil rights establishment, our political leaders, to hold the Congressional Black Caucus? I mean, what are they doing specifically? So part of what I think we're experiencing, Sam, is a nadir in African-American politics. We're experiencing the lowest point, a low point, right? A crisis in the African American political class, and I think we're experiencing a crisis in the African American intellectual class. When Professor Melissa Harris Perry, and I name her because she wrote the piece in The Nation, when she writes this piece and she responds on the Ed Schultz show, she basically said this: 85% of African Americans support Obama. Why don't we trust them? Right? And it's interesting that this is not the kind of complaint that a response that progressives would give when they read what went wrong with Kansas.
Right.
Right? This is not the response that we give, we offer when we see that a large number of Americans voted for George W. Bush. No, what we do is we organize, we try to put out the information that will enable everyday ordinary folks to kind of see how power is functioning and operating. We don't condescend, but we want to convince them otherwise.
Right.
So
I mean, people could say the same thing to her. I don't mean to single her out, but people could say the same thing to me as a progressive. Something like 85% of progressives still support, self-identified liberals, still support, are still very supportive of Obama. So that's, I think that critique misses the point. But we have got to go.
Well, I appreciate the conversation.
Well, I'd like to continue this in the near future. It's fascinating stuff, and I think it's a conversation that we don't hear enough. And I commend Professor West for raising it, because the cruel twist here is that the plight of the African American community in some respects has a harder time expressing itself in this era than it might otherwise.
Exactly. And we've always been the canary in the mine, as Lonnie Guinier said. And so the desperation that the country is experiencing, you can imagine the depths of that desperation that's taking place in black communities throughout this country.
Professor Eddie Glaude from Princeton, thanks so much for joining us. Hope to talk to you again soon.